Okay, so we're talking about short run aggregate supply, and again, it slopes upward. Key reason: sticky input costs. Well, if as they say, wages are sticky. It takes a while to adjust. All right, and wages would be one of the key input costs. Um, Menu costs. The firms are reluctant to change their menu prices. Then demand is going to increase if aggregate price level is going up, so they're going to be making more. So we've got that sloping up with aggregate price level going up. Now, if aggregate price level, let's say, is going down, so really the real wage should be going down along with it, but workers would be again reluctant. Again, it's money illusion. They're reluctant to accept that change in their real wage, and so firms would cut back, on their production. That's why it moves. They move together. Just the opposite of again we were talking about before. We were just talking about demand and supply. Short run aggregate supply. These two move together. So there's a positive slope. It can shift as well, and that would be finally when the input prices or input costs do change, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Again, wages are the key input for business. If input costs or wages go down, firms can make more, and it will shift short run aggregate supply to the right. If wages go up, again, firms have less money, so short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. Okay? Expectations, again, very important. How do you think things are going to be? Almost, again, like a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Number 3, shocks. Typically, when we talk about shocks, especially if you've had high school economics, they usually talk about negative, meaning it's going to shift that to the left. However, let's remember we still once in a while can have a positive shock. A few years ago, for instance, and again, we're not going to argue the good, the bad, or the ugly of it in terms of the environmental impact, but we would have to say that fracking and that horizontal drilling did allow us to become, at least for a while, a few years ago, energy independent. And that was a positive, or to the right, shift of the short run aggregate supply. Okay, so we put them all together, we end up with something like this, and this is, again, aggregate price level, real GDP, our long run aggregate supply, which is a set amount, aggregate demand, and short run aggregate supply. Now, when it looks like this, we are in long run and short run equilibrium. Okay? Let's see what happens when they move. As we know, this is economics, so they are going to move. This is just a blow up again of that graph. And here we say, all right, if you had whatever you want, you can adjust everything. You say, all right, we could do 30, let's say, $1 trillion worth of, we could make $30 trillion worth of stuff. All right, fine. Then that would bring us our long run aggregate supply, down, straight down to 30 trillion. Now, this is also called, this point here is also called our potential output. All right. Now we are considered at this point. We are considered to be at full employment. We are at our potential, even though they say yes, we're at full employment. Even though we may be experiencing 4 or 5% unemployment, which is frictional and structural from the last exam. Okay, and we're going to talk about now recessionary and inflationary gaps. Now, right now, we are in long run and short run equilibrium. But let's see what happens when aggregate demand shifts to the left, and then we're going to see what happens when aggregate demand shifts to the right. Okay? All right. All right. If something happened, like this not being completely even, all right? All right, if something happened and aggregate demand here, we are up here, we're in long run, short run equilibrium, but something happened and whether national income went down, something tragic happened and aggregate demand shifted to the left. What happens? Well, okay, we have this new line here. So it shifted to here, and we are at this point, okay? So at that point we say, okay, we are in short run equilibrium, but we are to the left. We are not in long run equilibrium anymore, okay? So we have a gap here between where we are and what our potential is. So let's say this was 30 trillion, and by shifting it to the left, we are at 28 trillion. All right, that gap, we are in a recession because, you know, obviously there's less real GDP, less transactions are being made. We are in a recession, and there's a gap between where we are and where our potential is, so we call that a recessionary gap. And what happens? Okay, well, in a recessionary gap, and see, we move from 1 to 2. So we move from 1 to 2. What happens? Well, we're in a recession. What is happening? Well, eventually, now at first, it doesn't happen because wages are sticky. But eventually, in this recession, wages become unstuck. And since we're in a recession, they go down. Now, that key input, wages, has gone down, so producers can now make more. So that's going to shift the short run aggregate supply to the right. So this line, which was the original short run aggregate supply, it's going to shift to the right, to here. So we go from 1 to 2, we're in this recessionary gap, but then input costs, wages go down, and short run aggregate supply increases, and then brings us back to this line, and so we are back here at point 3, back to long run and short run equilibrium, albeit we are at a lower aggregate price level, okay? And that's the scenario when aggregate demand shifts to the left. Now, let's say aggregate demand shifts to the right, and we are starting here at this point. Aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply right here, but something happens, consumer exuberance, something causes aggregate demand to shift to the right, and it does, and we go from here all the way over to here, all right? So we shift all the way to here. Now we were here, and we're no longer here, we're all the way up here. Now, remember, we said, well, our potential is 30 trillion, and now we're at this point, we're at, 31 or 32 trillion. You'll say, well, how can we be beyond our potential? All right? Think of it this way. Think of it as normally you're operating at a 40-hour work week, okay? Now, somebody comes to us and says, hey, or comes to you and says, hey, can you work a 65-hour work week? And you say, well, yeah, I can, but there's only so long you can do that for, all right? So that's somewhat like the position we're in here. We're beyond our potential. We're beyond that regular 40-hour work week. So we're beyond our potential, but it's really something that we're not going to be able to sustain over the long run. So what happens is we are beyond our potential, so we're going to have prices going up, and eventually wages will get unstuck, and guess what? They're going to go up. So we have this gap here. We're above, to the right of long-run aggregate supply, and we have inflation, and there's a gap, so we have an inflationary gap. Now, with the prices going up, producers are going to be making less. Now that will shift the short-run aggregate supply back to the left. So this is just the reverse of this process. We go from 1 to here up to 2, which gives us this inflationary gap. But then eventually, with the wages going up, producers are making less, and it shifts over here. So we go from 1 to 2 and back to 3. So back to long run and short run aggregate equilibrium, but at a higher aggregate price level. Okay? All right, so that's a scenario if aggregate demand shifts to the right. Okay. Now, we talked about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So let's talk about aggregate expenditure for a little bit. And I know we talked about this. Again, aggregate expenditure, it's expenditure all summed together from everywhere. So we say, okay, from all sectors of the economy, so from C, consumers, which is the key, which is really the key expenditure. It's you and I, and then investment spending, spending for future production, government spending, and net exports, okay? All right, let's take a closer look at C. Now C, first of all, is we look at, they call it disposable income. And disposable income just is, we add our income up from every source, okay? And once we've got that figure, we call it Y, all right? So you've got all your income from every source, and you have to pay taxes, so we have to subtract T. This is what they call disposable income, because if you add up all your income from every source, subtracting the taxes, what you have left is the income that you can dispose of as you wish. So they name it disposable income. All right, now, again, with disposable income, you have two options. You either can spend it or you save it, okay? So I say, all right, that's fine. So we have to look at what they call our marginal propensity to consume, all right? So what happens when, we are receiving income, but we get a $1,000 increase in our income? How much of it do we spend? Do we spend it all? Do we spend a little bit, half of it? Whatever it is, that is going to tell us what our marginal propensity to consume is and how much of it are we going to spend. So marginal propensity to consume is important because that fraction or that percentage is going to give us what they call the multiplier, meaning if the government pumps in a dollar into our economy, does real GDP go up by just a dollar, or does it go up by more? Is it multiplied by something? Does that $1 turn over and over a bit faster or a bit more, causing real GDP to go up by more than a dollar? So when we look at it, we say, okay, marginal propensity to consume. Let's find out, how we arrive at it. And I know we've already kind of gone over it, but we'll go over it again. Okay, so if you got a $1,000 raise, how much would you spend? Well, we're going to use this. It's a pretty simple example, but it's probably not too far from the truth. Matter of fact, when you look at our country as a whole, and our savings rate, our marginal propensity to consume is pretty darn high. Um, anyway, for this example, and for the sake of just these questions, we'll say you spend 750 of the 1,000, okay? Which I don't think is too unreasonable. So we say, all right, so our marginal propensity to consume is my change in spending over the change in income. Well, our income went up by 1,000, so we put that there. And of the 1,000, we're spending 750. So we have 750 over 1,000. Well, that's 3/4, okay? And that 3/4 is our marginal propensity to consume, okay? So, and if we spend 3/4 of the money, remember there's only two things we can do with it. If we spend 3/4 of it, then that means, by definition, that we're saving 1/4 of it. And that would be our marginal propensity to save, okay? Marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to save always equals 1. I mean, and just if we're spending 3/4, and there's only two things we can do with it, then we're saving 1/4. So these two always equal 1. Anyway, we need the marginal propensity to consume because we want to figure out what that multiplier is when let's say the government pumps in $1 into our economy. Again, does it go up? Does real GDP just grow by $1, or does it grow by more? Okay, so how do we figure that? Well, what we do is we take this fractions and we say, all right, we're going to have 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. And it's not, if we take it slowly, it's not that big of a deal. We just say, all right, so that's 1 over 1 minus 3/4, because that was the marginal propensity to consume, which means it's 1 over 1/4. And whenever you have 1 over a fraction like this, you flip it, and that 1/4 becomes 4 over that. 1 over 1 over 4 becomes 4 over 1. So the long and the short of it is, we use the marginal propensity to consume to figure out the multiplier. In this case, if we're spending 750 of the 1,000, that's 3/4, and that will result from this. That will result in a multiplier of 4. So typically, if the government pumped in $1 into our economy, real GDP shouldn't grow by just $1. It should grow by, being multiplied by 4, by $4, okay? And this is going to give us the slope of our aggregate expenditure line, which we'll talk about briefly in just a second. But I want to make sure everybody's got this. 750 of 1,000 gives us 3/4. 3/4 will end up giving us a multiplier of 4. All right? Okay. Okay, now we're here at aggregate expenditure, okay? And aggregate expenditure, again, expenditure from every part of the economy. As we were talking about before, we mentioned it. How do we arrive at, our aggregate expenditure? Well, again, if none of us, God forbid, had any income at all, if we had no disposable income, somehow we would still, be spending some money on something, all right? Might not be much, but probably, we probably would still spend a couple of $100s a month on something, even without any income, all right? So they call that autonomous consumption spending, because it's spending that we would do even, whether we're getting a handout from a relative or friend, or some help from the government, something, we are going to spend a little money even without income. So we have to, that's our starting point. We don't start at 0, in other words. We don't say, oh, no income, we're not spending at all. No, we do spend something. So we call that autonomous consumption spending. We call it A, okay? So C, we're going to break it down into, we start with A, that means spend even without income. And then we take our disposable income, which was total income minus taxes, which is this, and then we multiply it by that marginal propensity to consume, which just makes sense. I mean, of this disposable income, how much do we spend? And this marginal propensity to consume times it is going to tell us how much of it we spent. So for instance, if your salary was $100,000, all right, that would, and let's say it is your, that's after taxes, so it's disposable income. Let's say you make 120, you pay 20 in taxes, so you got $100,000 of disposable income, and your marginal propensity to consume is 3/4. Well, that would be 3/4 times this 100,000, so you're going to spend $75,000. And let's say you spend, you would have spent $500 a month, even without income. So that's another 6. So that would be 6 added to the 75. All right. Anyway, that's how C breaks down. Okay. Now, investment spending is interesting because it really, businesses would like to think that they have a plan, they stick to the plan, and everything goes according to plan. In real life, that doesn't happen. So we break investment spending down into planned and unplanned, okay? And basically, unplanned just is the adjustment. Either we didn't make enough, which means unplanned spending is negative, we gotta make more, or guess what, we made way too much, so our unplanned spending, we have to cut it back, okay? So investment is comprised of both planned and unplanned, all right? Then we just say, all right, we have that, and we know the C is broken down like this, I is broken down like this, and then naturally we add government spending, final goods and services, and net exports, and that gives us our aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G plus net exports. And graphically, let's take a look at it. What does that look like? Graphically, well, now this is not necessarily you're going to need as an answer to this, but it's just showing you that basically if we have this line drawn, and again, this is aggregate expenditure, and this is real GDP. This line represents everything that was made is bought. Everything is, that's why it's 45 degrees. Everything that's made is bought, okay? However, if our spending line is here, where it crosses the line where everything that is made is bought is here. So that's, let's say, $20 trillion. Just the long and the short of it is that if we were somewhere along here, all right, bringing it down, we said, oh, you know, we haven't made enough stuff. Okay, so our unplanned spending, you know, we didn't make enough. We could go all the way to here. So, is unplanned, they call it negative. So we make more. Here, we've gone a little bit too far. We made too much stuff. So unplanned spending is a positive, and we have to cut back to here. Okay, it's called a Keynesian cross. But anyway. Graphically, as we were talking about before, we have C, and then we had investment, again, planned and unplanned, adding the government and net exports. Now, here's what the line looks like, all right? And the reason why the multiplier was important is because on this graph we see that, okay, if we increase this by $1. What does that do down here? And graphically, with our example at least, it's showing that if this is real GDP, going up by $1 here, we're going to grow, you know, here by $4. Okay, so that's what that looks like on a graph, and that is about it. That should wrap it up for the third exam. Take your time, answer everything. You've got plenty of time to take this exam in terms of days, and you also have 3 hours to take it. So good luck, everybody, and I'll see you in the next video.